Hi, everyone. So, welcome to Beaconsfield podcast. I'm really privileged today to be sitting down and speaking with Professor Richard Bourke. Professor Richard Bourke is Professor of the History of Political Thought at Cambridge and Fellow of King's College. In 2018, he was elected to the chair in the History of Political Thought at Cambridge and also as a Fellow of the British Academy. He's currently working on the philosophy of history since Kant and the history of democracy. Today, however, we're going to be speaking about the person who inspired this podcast, Edmund Burke. Richard wrote a book in 2015 on Edmund Burke titled Empire and Revolution, The Political Life of Edmund Burke. It's here, right? So this is the landmark study of Burke's life in ideas and politics over the last 5 years, and it's attracted many accolades and distinctions. And personally, it's been one of the most remarkable and memorable pieces of scholarship that I've ever interacted with. It's had a huge impact on my thinking about Burke, my interest in him, and has brought him to life in a way that affirms his relevance for the modern day. So thank you so much, Professor Burke, for coming on today.
Great to talk to you today. Yep.
Cool. So how about we start off with some generalities? Not all of our listeners are going to be familiar with who Edmund Burke is. So who was Edmund Burke, and what do you think his relevance is to the way we think about institutional reform and cultural change today? These are the big themes of this podcast.
Okay, well, perhaps it might be best if I just say a very little bit quickly about his life and then turn to your main question about relevance. Well, Burke was born in Dublin in 1730. I'm going to turn off my email.
No worries.
Yeah, that happens.
It happens.
He was born in Dublin in 1730 to a religiously mixed family. His mother was a Catholic and his father was a member of the established Anglican Protestant Church. He attended Trinity College Dublin as an undergraduate, but he then moved to London to study for the bar. He never became a practicing barrister because in the meantime, he sort of became caught up in the world of letters, essentially, but also became a man of business. And it's from that latter position that he made a sort of sideways move into politics as the secretary to the Marquis of Rockingham, who in 1765 was essentially prime minister. And from that position, Burke then stood for Parliament and became an MP at the end of 65, beginning of 66. And his career thereafter was largely determined by the events which were thrown up by Britain's position in the wider world, and of course domestically as well, as these affected Parliament. So it's his parliamentary career that shapes his life, essentially. So the relevance of all that is the relevance of him to us today. I find that a very difficult question to answer. I'm not a big relevance person, unfortunately, from the point of view of your question. What I think he adds depth to our understanding of the period. That's to say, a sort of period of major transition around the rise of the European empires and the impact of the French Revolution. So he adds depth and complexity to our understanding of that period, which is in turn essential for understanding how we got to where we are. So I think of his relevance as being indirect. He's one voice amongst many who contributes to our understanding of our historical position by understanding it relative to him amongst many other people. So I'm not deeply committed to extracting doctrine. However, there are lots of doctrines and I'm happy to talk about them.
That's wonderful. I guess we can start off on an aspect of that legacy question, I guess, where what's intimated by your response there is that people have done that to Burke, right? They've extracted him and taken his legacy perhaps out of its context in a way that's not necessarily helpful. And early in your book, Empire and Revolution, you make this point that the scholarship has traditionally treated Burke as two Burkes, right? There's Burke the liberal reformer and then Burke the conservative. Following on from your comments just then, to what extent do you think this distinction is an oversimplification of Burke? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, well, what you say is correct. There have always been, as it were, left and right Burkeans, or as you put it, a liberal school and a conservative school. One immediate problem is that as sort of disembodied or trans-historical ideologies, liberalism and conservatism had no traction really the period in which Burke was living. Both are doctrines that emerged in the 19th century, later in the 19th century. He dies in 1797. Um, Also, at the same time, a further complication is that liberalism, if we were to treat it as an abstraction, is associated with a set of principles, whereas conservatism, in a way, is associated with an attitude. Um, so, I mean, it's perfectly possible to say that there are elements of Burkean thought which end up being perfectly conformable to or compatible with elements that come to constitute liberalism. That's true. Various constitutional principles, various principles of government, various attitudes to trade. We latterly associate some of those ideas or doctrines with what came to be called liberalism. Liberalism itself not being a static ideological phenomenon, but something which is itself in complicated development over the last 250 years. So that's liberalism. Conservatism as an attitude, well, of course, many political positions incorporate within themselves conservative attitudes. Stalinism has elements of conservatism. Welfarism has elements of conservatism. I mean, in other words, most political positions want to conserve themselves. I mean, there's an argument to be had perhaps about anarchism, but even anarchism wants to conserve values against the state. So if you look at these, therefore, as abstractions, they're too abstract to help us, by which I don't mean they don't guide us at all, because they can point us to certain principles, which Burke did at the time seek to support. And of course, there are some things that he wanted to conserve and other things that he wished not to conserve. You know, I view these things somewhat more fluidly, and I don't get anxious about compartmentalization. Academics get very anxious about compartmentalization, partly because of antecedent ideological commitments and the determination to see past thinkers as being on the appropriate side. If you liberate yourself from that, I think you end up with a more interesting field of inquiry on your hands.
That's deeply interesting, because what I wanted to ask you about next was the proper way to read Burke. And, you know, you write in your book about Burke's philosophy of history, for example. And it seems like, especially from reading Burke and your own work, that Burke is trying to effect this shift away from abstract thinking separated from the circumstances or the historical and social conditions that give meaning to actions. And I was wondering if you could speak to us about what Burke's philosophy of history was, and particularly what it meant for Burke as a philosopher in action, this philosopher-statesman trying to use historical and philosophical thinking at the time to effect institutional reform interventions in Parliament.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, partly because very complicated. I mean, I think Burke's age was an historical age. I think if you compare political and moral reflection in the 17th century, which tends to be more deductive, geometrical, a prioristic, and so on and so forth, in some cases empirical, but in that case inductive. By comparison, by the mid-18th century, a lot of thinkers with a philosophical interest in politics, Hume, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Adam Smith, many of them approach their subject, the discipline of politics itself through an historical frame. And really, I think in a sort of within a world historical framework. So they're both interested in, as it were, the history of man, that's to say, the anthropological development of the human species over time, and the steady progress and complexification of human development, moving from crudeness or rudeness steadily towards refinement, and what that trajectory entails, what positive acquisitions come with that and what losses accompany it also. So that's the sort of big picture philosophical histories that you begin to get from the 1740s, 1750s onwards. But at the same time, with Burke and his contemporaries, especially with Montesquieu, there's an interest in viewing contemporary regimes comparatively. And that means comparatively in a contemporary context, but also in an historical context. So that's to say, if you're interested in European politics, you might be interested in it by comparison with ancient Europe on the one hand, but also by comparison with the East on the other hand. So there's a tendency to juxtapose modern politics against ancient and sort of European against the politics of the so-called Orient, and compare and contrast those regimes, but also within Europe itself, an interest in comparative constitutional analysis, republics versus monarchies, France versus Britain. In any case, my point is these are all historical configurations or ways of framing politics that's essentially historical. And I suppose the argument would be that such historical depth gives one political orientation. So an historical study of politics orientates one with respect to political possibilities. So in a way, that's a sort of general framing. So it gives depth to political judgment by giving it weight of historical analysis, essentially.
Right, that's really interesting, because something that you do write about in your work quite a bit is political judgment. What is political judgment, and how did Burke use it? How did he think that we could cultivate it, or how did he cultivate it?
Well, that's an interesting and complicated question, really. I mean, it can be approached from various angles. First of all, as an analyst of politics, what should political judgment be in that context would be a first sort of stab at the question. And for Burke, it had to be first and foremost, well, it was, of course, a moral enterprise, and therefore it had normative dimensions, but it didn't involve simply, as it were, the naked application of normative principle indiscriminately to political reality. So it had to begin with the empirically given, the sort of substance of politics facing one. And that empirically given reality was, of course, an historically embedded one. It was not just the here and now, but the here and now as it had come to be constituted by the past. So political judgment essentially meant, of course, having one's normative prescriptions, but activating them or animating them in the context of that richly textured historical reality. So that's, as it were, philosophical analysis, which is geared towards judgment informed by historical texture. But of course, then there are the political judgments of politicians. I think Burke would want to make 2 points there, or at least I'll make 2 points on his behalf, which is that, of course, there are personal attributes which lend themselves more to sound political, or better to sound political judgment. And that would include the independence of one's position. I mean, if one is suffering under exigency or desperately advancing one's own cause, then obviously that would impoverish judgment. Sort of depth of experience of affairs is another key attribute. I mean, in many ways, the way to think about the attributes of the statesman is by contrasting what Burke thought of as ideal statesmanship with the case of French revolutionary representatives and administrators after 1789. And he basically associated them with sort of desperate willfulness, lack of experience of affairs, a sort of disputatious litigiousness rather than a capacity for grounding principles in in a wider commitment to overall welfare. So there are, in other words, in addition to the philosophical view of judgment, then the practical views of the statesman's judgment. But a very important final point on that would be, of course, it's absolutely essential to see that political judgment is not just a personal attribute of the philosopher or the statesman. It's an attribute of a regime as well. And a constitutional regime pits one set of judgments against another set of judgments. I mean, insofar as constitutions involve balancing and or separation of powers, in effect, they're balancing and separating judgments. So sound political judgment is also a function of sound constitutional arrangements. So that's the sort of final point I'd make in that context.
Yeah, wow. So the next question I was going to ask you was about why Burke preferences reform over revolution. And I guess that's really got something to do with where you just left off, about preserving arrangements. So I guess, yeah, that's the question I have. Why in France, for example, is Burke so inclined to try and preserve and reform rather than to, radically upend the existing order?
Well, I mean, I think the best way of answering that question is to begin by looking at his understanding of revolution itself. It's partly worth bearing in mind that the meaning of revolution is undergoing transformation in this period, really, partly in response to what had happened in America between the 1760s and, say, 1787, but more particularly and more sharply in response to what had happened in France, but also, one might say, in a relevant key, what had happened in India, I think, because Burke sees the experience of India under the East India Company as having been a revolutionary one. The basic point, though, is that revolution for Burke, if you just take his understanding in the 1790s, really had various components. And it first of all meant primarily a resistance to a regime. So in a way that was an old meaning, resistance to state authority. So that continued to be part of its meaning. But it also meant fundamentally transforming society and government itself in the process. And in a way, that's especially what Burke was objecting to, revolution as abolishing the means of reform in the process of revolutionizing society and politics. So in a way, he associated for that reason what was going on in France with what had gone on in India. That's to say, both the French revolutionary regime and the East India Company in South Asia had treated their respective territories as countries of conquest, as if, first of all, it was legitimate to abolish all institutional bulwarks and prescriptive norms, and second of all, as if it were rational or prudential to do so, because once you've abolished all the means of advancing political causes, then your only choice is to advance political projects by, as we might say, by fiat or despotically. So revolution for that reason, in its sort of mature meaning, essentially for Burke, it meant a sort of politics of abolition or annihilation, and therefore simply wasn't conducive to sensible political goals at all. And reform, of course, was just a means of advancing a political cause. And for that reason, it seemed like a more rational approach. But of course, reform itself covers a multitude of possibilities. But that, to begin with, is at least the stark antithesis between the two.
So if we tie the American Revolution into that analysis, is it that Burke sees that revolution as restorative of something? Is that why he supports that revolution so wholeheartedly and opposes the other two?
Yes, well, Burke's response to developments in the American colonies between, say, 1766 and 76 is a complicated one. because he sees the agent of innovation here as having been the British Crown at its ministry. So a revolution, as it were, is not sparked, as far as he's concerned, by the colonies, but introduced to the colonies by British policy. And the revolution, or if you like, radical revision, involved placing the colonies on a new constitutional footing, where the colonies had been a source of revenue via trade and such taxation as came with the Navigation Acts. From 64, 65, 66 onwards, a sequence of British ministries attempted to extract revenue from the colonies by direct taxation. Burke thought that was a sort of reversion from the status quo ante. It was an upending of customary imperial relations. And of course, the problem with it was that it was resisted. Now, Burke thought that resistance was legitimate. And in fact, intriguingly, he thought even ultimately when Britain in the sort of around 74, 75, started imposing its will more drastically, Burke came to think that American resistance by resort to arms was itself legitimate. So that's to say, on one definition of revolution, that's to say, an attempt to subvert, to rightfully subvert a regime by armed insurrection, Burke actually justified that as acceptable in terms of political morality. But he didn't support the goals of the revolution as these came to be advocated after 1776. That's to say, he didn't support American independence. And up until very, very late, even during the war against the American colonies, still sought to recover the colonies and bring them back in under the empire, albeit under revised terms. So that's why Burke wanted to restore something. He wanted to restore a mutually beneficial imperial relationship, as against, on the one hand, independence being sought after 1776 by the colonies, but also as against sort of, as he saw it, ministerial despotism, introducing, without popular support, a new scheme for administering that portion of the empire.
Let's talk about the empire then, because I mean your book's called Empire and Revolution, right? And
yeah,
what was Burke's ideal view, if we can call it that, of the empire, and to what extent did that motivate his reforms? For example, I've seen you write about the empire as a trust, as a form of accountable power that the British people must wield on behalf of something. I'm not quite sure what that something is. But could you tell us a bit about how Burke views the relationship between empire and trust?
yes. Interestingly, in this period, Britain becomes increasingly self-conscious about having an empire as such. But that was a very complicated transoceanic arrangement, or set of arrangements. And I suppose that's the fundamental point. It was distinct sets of arrangements which had been acquired by the metropole, or stipulated or prescribed by the metropole, over, in turn, a complex historical process which is not reducible to one uniform process. So in the primary components of the empire in Burke's day were, first of all, the neighboring island of Ireland. Second of all, the American and generally West Indian colonies. And third of all, South Asia, with other bits, for instance, the Cape and the Far East and West Africa being areas of British concern as well. So it's a rather complicated picture. And he didn't have a uniform view about it all, because they all posed different problems and shifting problems, because, of course, the colonies gained independence in the midst of Burke's career. And India, the government of India was transformed in the course of Burke's career, as with the government of Ireland and the government of Quebec. So these are all very different fields, and they're also shifting fields. And so his own views are developing. The fundamental point, I would say, in direct answer to the question about trust, is he thought that all government, all administration, all politics should be based on some species of consent. And consent is essentially another word for trust, that there should be fundamentally a fideistic relationship between governors and governed. And if you violated that, you had no legitimate basis for administration at all. So that's the fundamental, as it were, a fundamental norm of politics, that it should be based on trust or consent in that sense. In addition, of course, politics had other responsibilities, like more generally liberalizing power. But of course, that was more and less possible in different circumstances. But broadly speaking, Burke's goal for what he became conscious of as the empire, indeed, from about the 1770s onwards, was to sustain consent and liberalize power. But of course, that vocation, if you like, had been violated in the case of the American colonies, where trust was undermined progressively until secession became a fait accompli, and had been successively undermined. For instance, to take the other most important case during the course of his career, the case of India, or the Indian subcontinent. There, Britain had inherited a complex situation, but if I'm to put it as simply as possible, progressively undermined the very possibility of trust as it proceeded in its administration. So he became a sort of powerful critic of the modalities of government pursued by the East India Company under the authority of Westminster through the course of the final third of the 18th century.
Yeah, something that I'm kind of working on myself and thinking about is Burke's intense worry, I guess, of the corruption of English manners occurring abroad in India. And so, you know, he talks about these young British adventurers going over via the East India Company to India, birds of prey, he calls them, and going about all forms of extortion and corruption in the subcontinent. Could you please tell us about why Burke is so worried about that particular group of privileged young men going over and doing that, and also what his strategy is to try and hold those people accountable? Because it seems to be a persistent theme, particularly in, you know, speech of Fox's on Fox's East India Bill and so forth.
Yeah. Well, Burke's connection to India was a shifting one. So perhaps I should begin by basically outlining the stages through which he moved very briefly before addressing specifically the question about corruption of English manners and how to call the East India Company to account, and therefore its officers. Well, of course, Burke's interest in India began much as his interest in the American colonies had, in response to government action. He was, for the most of his career, he was an opposition MP, so his job was largely to criticize the administration of the day. Of course, the administration's job was to increase supply, to raise levels of taxation. I mean, it was fighting wars in Europe. Britain was fighting wars in Europe through much of the 18th century, and these were costly. And when it wasn't at war, was still in debt for the reason of having been at war, and those debts had to be redeemed by some means. So revenue was an essential concern of the British government. And just as Britain's relationship to America was transformed after the 7 Years' War in a state of great metropolitan indebtedness by the need for revenue, and therefore, in other words, taxing the colonies, the same process began in relation to the East India Company from about 1770 really onwards, even earlier actually. Now Burke becomes involved in criticizing the government's attempt, the British government's attempt to tax the East India Company itself to extract revenue from it, because they see it as a sort of, hen that lays the golden eggs. And Burke saw this as an attempt by the ministry to overextend its power. So he begins his career as a defender of the East India Company against the depredations of ministerial expansiveness, if you like. But he becomes more deeply involved from about 1777 onwards. Between that date and about 1783, becomes particularly involved in developments in southern India around Madras. And later on, in turn, becomes highly critical of developments in northeastern India around Bengal. And basically, he becomes concerned by the development of British power on the subcontinent, which had transformed itself massively between, roughly speaking, 1756 and 65, between the date when it became really a military power in the subcontinent, partly by happenstance or accidents, or at least it surprised Britain itself that it became a military power there, just by means of the superiority of its infantry formations and so on and so forth. But between then and 1765, when it became a territorial power, really as a result of acquiring the right of raising or administering really taxation on behalf of the Mughal emperor. So now Britain was suddenly, an imperial power in the East as opposed to just a trading factory. And from that date on, its tentacles, the tentacles of the East India Company, spread increasingly throughout the regions of the northeast and the south. From about 1784 onwards, Burke begins to hold a particular person responsible for this development, and that's the Governor General of the East India Company, Hastings. He proceeds to impeach Hastings. The impeachment trial fails. Warren Hastings is acquitted in 1794, and Burke's parliamentary career ends then essentially in failure. So the question is, what was he criticizing? So what was this breach of trust in this case, or how was it that the East India Company was operating? So there's a criticism on the level of criticizing individual personnel, the birds of prey, which are the young company officers, on the one hand, and then the structural problem, which is enabling them. So I think it's really the structural problem that's enabling them that is the major problem. So it's the structure that corrupts their manners. It's very important to say that Burke's worry is not about their manners being corrupted by, as it were, mixing with South Asian society. That's not his concern at all. It's about the East India Company corrupting their, as it were, attitude to politics altogether, since they are officials administering a territory. Now, all this stemmed from a fundamental corruption in East India Company politics, and Burke saw this corruption as having caused the East India Company, and therefore directly the British Empire in South Asia, caused it to be one of the most nefarious systems of power known throughout the course of European history. And in this he concurred with other contemporaries like Adam Smith. They just thought it was an appalling construction because of its, as it were, fundamental indisposition to be called to account. Now, that is because the East India Company was on the one hand a commercial enterprise, and on the other hand a political enterprise. And it confused these two enterprises in a mutually corrupting downward spiral of, political despotism, essentially. As a commercial enterprise, it wasn't a purely commercial enterprise because it was actually a commercial monopoly. As a political enterprise, it wasn't a properly political enterprise because its objective was not national or, if you like, provincial welfare. Its project was to extract profit in the form of trade, albeit monopolized trade. But its goal there was to, be like any corporate commercial concern, was to extract its profit from a population. Whereas the goal of politics is, of course, not profit extraction. The goal of politics is provision for national welfare. So these two, the attempt to get these two mutually contradictory principles to act in harmony in the case of the government of South Asia was a catastrophic, ended in a catastrophic disregard for local welfare. And this was especially prosecuted, as Burke was concerned, by Hastings. And he also pursued this, as it were, political/commercial lust via an expansionist policy in contravention of the goals set for politics by the metropolitan power as such. We think of 18th century Britain as sort of determined towards expansion from the center. Actually, things are a lot more complicated. That's to say, at the periphery, the impulse or pressure to expand came in the form of, for instance, the East India Company Governor General himself, and aided and abetted by officers who were also corrupted by this culture. So there's the birds of prey that we're mentioning. They're birds of prey and passage, as he puts it, because, of course, they don't stay in the territory long. They've no sense of obligation there. They have no grounding in a more fully weighted set of political experiences. So they're youthful conquistadors, driven towards depredation, with no system to hold them to account and no inclination to be called to account, and in any case, just as it were, passing through and sucking up what's available to them. So the answer what to do about all that can be phrased rather quickly, which is simply to hold them to account. Burke, first of all, with the Fox's East India Bill of '83, sought to do that by literally subjecting the East India Company to parliamentary control. But that project failed, of course, because George III conspired against it and Parliament voted it down, and the Foxites, along with Burke, fell from power and then entered into another period in the political wilderness down to and including Burke's death. So it's at that point that he embarked upon his impeachment, because he saw this is the only means of at least setting up, as it were, a sort of tribunal, an impeachment tribunal, which would in turn establish norms of governance, which would at least be an example of a framework of, appropriate political morality, which would hold future governors in check.
So how did Burke design and communicate that framework? Because what's really interesting about what you just said is that you talk about there being this systemic, intractable, fundamental corruption that's working, throughout this entire system. And if Burke's solution is accountability, what does that look like in terms of cultural accountability? Because it seems to me that in the impeachment, for example, he uses a whole host of sacred artifacts of British history, if you like, historical resources, conceptual resources, emotive stories that he thinks the British public are going to feel attached to and care about. Is Burke trying to hold up a mirror to nature, as it were? Is he trying to say, hey, you're infringing these values which you hold dear overseas? British values are being corrupted in India. Is that his rhetorical strategy in the Hastings impeachment? And how does that therefore fold into this kind of cultural accountability strategy which he's taking to this systemic problem?
Yes, well, I mean, of course, it's very important to remember that the Hastings trial gets off to a sort of great start. I
Yeah.
mean, with much fanfare and much public interest, and you know, there's no profound difficulty at that stage. But of course, it lasts. Over 7 years, and the presentation of evidence is extraordinarily complex and, of course, tendentious. And holding the audience of the law lords over protracted periods of time. For instance, Burke's opening speech lasted 4 days, and I think his closing speech lasted 6 days, and that's just as it were, the book ending of the impeachment. So interest had to be sustained. So that's just another way of saying a rhetorical strategy was certainly required. And part of Burke's strategy was to get his auditors to identify with the predicament of the South Asian, as he saw it, victims of British power. And that much of that was he attempted to achieve by as it were, collapsing distinctions and juxtaposing comparisons and making the situation in far off Bengal not so different from the proximate homestead. So that was one of the essential strategies of the impeachment trial, I think.
Yeah, because from my reading of Burke and from reading your book too, it seems like, it gets off to this great start. He tries to reject the rules of lower courts being applied, but it doesn't work out for him. But he keeps going. Like, he keeps going for a very long time, and he starts to lose the public interest as the trial proceeds. Without getting into psychological history, why do you think Burke keeps going so adamantly? What's driving him? What forces are driving him to keep trying to impeach Hastings when it's very clear, probably to him even, that the impeachment's not going so well?
Well, I think that will require some psychological speculation about why was it that Burke was such a relentless, many felt histrionic pursuer of righteous moral agendas, because he certainly was. I think part of it was just a sense of outrage. Part of it also was a sense that really very fundamental political norms had been violated in the case of the British administration of South Asia, which betrayed very problematic aspects of the tendency of modern culture to believe that power was not accountable at all. So I think if the question is, what outraged him morally about the conduct of the East India Company, for instance, in the person of Hastings, much as outraged him in the case of assorted French revolutionary regimes, I think it would just come down to the idea that politics could be conducted without being called normatively to account. I mean, Burke did have a developed Christian sense of the world. He did believe that human beings were answerable to a larger moral framework. That larger moral framework was something to which, if they didn't feel themselves to be subjected to, that it was going to have to be powerfully called to their attention. So I think part of it is his sense of aspects of modern power flating subverting the basic prescriptions of Christian normativity, broadly understood, as the basic principles of humanity.
So did he have like a developed systematic conception of that natural law position? Because something you write in your book and something I'm really confused about still is that there's this irreconcilable tension of sorts between his natural law position and between his kind of academic skepticism. I think you describe it like that. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
Sh- That's very complicated territory. It's
yeah,
very
yeah, I'm
complicated
sure.
partly because, of course,
Mm,
Burke's clearly not a systematic philosopher. I mean, he wrote an
yeah.
early work of philosophy, the inquiry into the origin of ideas of the sublime and beautiful. It's a very early work and a very sort of particular portion of
Mm,
moral and aesthetic philosophy. Um, but beyond that, we can trace philosophical assumptions he must have held because he portrays them in other works, but he doesn't really present a sort of systematic treatise-like discussion of such matters.
mm,
Um, but I think there is something one can say about it. First of all, commonsensically, of course, Burke was both a common law thinker and a natural law thinker. And of course, there's no contradiction there because, of course, underlying common law was natural law.
mm,
He was a natural law thinker necessarily because he was a Christian, and all natural law means is essentially that there is a moral order to human affairs subject to the divine will. The question is how you can access that will, how you can know it. And from that point of view, of course, Burke was some kind of academic skeptic. That's to say, you didn't have a direct, clear insight into the will of God, as it were. You could interpret it mostly indirectly by, for instance, the way the world is designed and the way we are designed. So, given that we are creatures of affect and sentiment and outraged by cruelty, it's reasonable to assume that we were designed like that, and therefore it makes sense to serve our
mm.
moral sensibility rather than violating our moral sensibility. So that's how he reconciles, as it were, an abstract normative order which is there but which we can't directly access with individual moral judgment. I
Yeah,
mean,
right. Yeah, I
yeah.
guess that a nice way to end this conversation then is, if we're looking at the Hastings impeachment, one of the final charges, if it's a charge, I'm not sure, that Burke gives at the end of the opening speech is, I'll quote it, "I impeach him in the name of human nature itself," he's talking about Hastings, "which he has cruelly outraged, injured, and oppressed in both sexes in every age, rank, situation, and condition of life," close quote. What was Burke's view of human nature? You were just talking about human beings as creatures of sentiments and so forth. Why does he choose human nature to be the final, proposition idea that has been infringed so violently by Hastings? Why has he not put the commons before that or the natural law? Why does he end with human nature?
Well, of course, uh, human nature is subject to a moral order. So impeaching him in the name of human nature is impeaching him in the name of humanity. And
Mm,
impeaching Hastings in the name of humanity means impeaching Hastings, if you accept my description of Burke as fundamentally some kind of skeptical Anglican, which others have argued too, I should say.
yeah.
Um, he is in impeaching Hastings in the name of humanity. It is in the name of human creatures as subjects of a divine will, as opposed to creatures of their own arbitrary, whimsical dispositions. We
Mm,
are subject to moral rules. So I mean, one could even say I impeach him in the name of the existence of an objective order of moral rules. It's the same statement. Human nature means humanity in that sense. That's
mm.
my reading of that.
Right, that's really interesting. And I guess then that Burke would be open to theories or principled ideas that respect that nature without trying to make, kind of rationally dogmatic claims to that objective reality or whatever. Like he's still thinking about it as a common law practitioner, would you agree, rather than a philosopher?
Yes, I mean, in other words, yeah, you don't. Well, there's various elements that go into how Burke thinks about these matters.
Hmm.
Common law is really a principle for domestic governance
Yeah.
and the organization of property and so on and so forth. This is a question of, as it were, global morality. So it doesn't just fall inside a particular jurisdiction. We're outside prescriptive law here, right? It's humanity itself, and therefore something that is transcendent to any national jurisdiction altogether. So it transcends any merely common law. There are fundamental norms to which political governors are subject, and they ought to recognize that about themselves. I mean, it's a moral plea in that sense. It's connected to natural law because it's the grounding of his moral plea. But that's, of course, a long way distance from sort of 1950s commentators on Burke who thought he was some kind of neo-scholastic natural lawyer.
Yeah.
There are many schools of natural law, including modern natural law, and that's a highly complex terrain. That there was a law of nature, many people agreed, but how one acted on and how one interpreted the laws of nature was exactly the field in which there was complex divergence. And one could piece together aspects of Burke's view there, but that's a sort of complicated process and would take us some time, I think.
Yeah, right. I guess the final question that I have is, there's a lovely phrase in your book where you say that Burke first deliberated upon problems and came up with a kind of position and then pursued that position fervently and defended that position. What's really come out of this conversation for me, particularly because I'm coming at it from this philosophical standpoint, is that Burke does seem first and foremost to be a thinker guided by principles that work in the circumstances, but principles that are attached nonetheless to experience, attached nonetheless to the actual practical art of statesmanship. I guess my final question is, would Burke have wanted to be seen as a philosopher? Yeah, and I'm not talking about our standards, I'm talking about his standards, as in his context. That's my final question.
I think not. I think you'd want to be seen as a statesman. First of all, I think it's important to say that the character of philosopher is itself not a stable one. It's been, it's been transformed over history. I mean, we don't think of economists as philosophers, but Adam Smith thought that his Wealth of Nations was a work of philosophy. So I see the very category as complicatedly shifting, but without getting into that sort of thicket. I think in any case, Burke thought of himself more as, to use a phrase he used, as a philosopher in action. But by that he meant a statesman who'd act on principle, but not an armchair philosopher in that sense. I mean, he was interested in the thick of politics. He was interested in the complex business of politics. In fact, he was starkly opposed to those with sort of part-time interests in political affairs simply because it excited their passions. I mean, he thought politics was hard work, a hard work of understanding and a hard work of application. And so he's closer to wanting to be a statesman. He's the center of his gravity is in affairs, really.
Well, Professor Burke, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, that's been a really interesting conversation that's reminded me to continually to look at Burke in his context, probably as he would have seen himself. I think that a lot of the problems come when we don't do that, and philosophers are probably quite responsible for that, I'd say. but thank you so much for coming on and speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.